You know, we're about to unpack one of the most bizarre but totally true stories I've ever come across. We're talking about a marijuana farm that was operating where no farm has ever operated before. Think about this, 800 feet straight up in the air inside a blimp. Let's just kick this off with a quote that, well, it pretty much says it all. Deputy Mike Bradley from the Chilton County Sheriff's Department said, "I have never busted a marijuana farm floating in a balloon 800 feet over Isabella. This is a first." And yeah, you can just imagine him shaking his head, right? He was the guy who first stumbled onto this thing, a case that would end up tying law enforcement in knots for almost 6 months.
So where does a story like this even begin? Well, it all started back in August of 2025. People in the small town of Isabella, Alabama, just started looking up, and they saw something really, really strange just hanging out in the sky.
And what they were seeing was this huge silver balloon, just hovering there. And it was always at the same height, about 800 feet up. Now, this thing wasn't just drifting by. Oh no, it was a permanent fixture, anchored to the ground with these seriously heavy-duty reinforced steel cables. Turns out this whole setup was actually a 60-foot dirigible. It used to be one of those advertising blimps for a car dealership that went out of business. And the guy behind it all, our protagonist, Wesley Duncan Pritchard, he apparently bought it for $8,000. And he didn't just tie it to a tree. He had it anchored to massive concrete foundations right there on his 12-acre property.
So that, of course, brings us to the man himself. Who is Wesley Duncan Pritchard? I mean, what makes a guy decide to launch a farm into the sky? Well, the answer is this wild mix of old family history and some surprisingly recent headlines.
You see, Pritchard's whole philosophy on this came straight from his dad. His father was a moonshiner, and get this, he managed to avoid getting caught for 30 years just by staying mobile and unpredictable. So his dad was always moving side to side. Wesley just took that same idea and went vertical. And that's where a more modern inspiration comes in. Pritchard was apparently watching the news during that whole Chinese spy balloon thing back in 2023, and he took away a very specific lesson from it. He thought, hey, if a foreign country can float a balloon clear across America and nobody touches it for weeks, then surely I can float a little farm over my own backyard. But what's really wild here is just how ingenious this whole setup was. I mean, this wasn't just a few plants dangling from a balloon. No way. This was a completely self-contained, high-tech agricultural facility. He had solar panels for power, a full hydroponic system, climate controls. He even had a motorized winch that he used to commute 800 feet up to his office every single day. Incredible. So as you can imagine, this whole thing quickly turned into a massive headache for law enforcement because Pritchard wasn't even trying to hide. He was operating right there, in plain sight, totally convinced he'd found the perfect legal loophole. When Deputy Bradley first called him up, after seeing these very obvious plants from the road, this is the story he got. Pritchard just casually said, "Oh, they're heirloom tomatoes. A very leafy variety." Yeah, the deputy, as you can probably guess, was not buying it for a second.
And that right there was the heart of Pritchard's whole defense. His argument was actually pretty simple, if a little audacious. He was basically saying, hey, am I really breaking Alabama state law if my farm isn't on Alabama soil? It's floating 800 feet above it in federal airspace. So here's the bottom line. Pritchard's argument, while clever, wasn't legally sound, but it was clever enough to cause months of total confusion. You had local cops, state police, and federal agencies all pointing fingers at each other, trying to figure out whose problem this was. In reality, the law's pretty clear. Growing marijuana is illegal, doesn't matter how high up you are. Plus, he was breaking a whole bunch of FAA regulations, so it wasn't a legal gray area, it was just a logistical nightmare for the cops. And this timeline really shows you how effective that confusion tactic was. It took a full 5 months from the first time someone called it in for the authorities to figure out not if they could arrest him, but how. I mean, think about it. You can't exactly send an officer shimmying up those cables, and you definitely can't just shoot down a blimp floating over a neighborhood. So with all their options on the ground pretty much exhausted, law enforcement had to get creative. They realized they had to go to him. They had to take to the skies and pull off a plan that, I guarantee you, nobody had ever trained for. And the solution was something straight out of an action movie. Seriously, an Alabama State Police helicopter flew right up alongside the blimp. The pilot had to match its altitude and its tiny little bit of speed perfectly so that agents could literally jump from the helicopter's skids over to the blimp's access platform. It was exactly what it sounds like, a SWAT raid, in midair. So how did Pritchard react to this insane, dramatic raid happening 800 feet in the air? Was he panicked? Did he resist? Nope, just calm resignation. Apparently, he looked at the agents, looked over at the helicopter, and just said, "Took you long enough." And then he offered to make them coffee. He had a whole setup in his sky office. So, with Wesley Pritchard and his high-flying farm finally back on solid ground, the story moves into its final chapter. Let's talk about the aftermath. As you might expect, Pritchard is now looking at a very long list of charges. We're talking state drug charges, plus a whole bunch of federal FAA violations. But get this, his lawyer says they still plan to fight the whole thing, based on that original argument about state versus federal airspace. We'll see how that goes. Meanwhile, back on the ground, the community was totally split. You had one group of people who, they weren't saying what he did was right, but they couldn't help but admire the ingenuity, the sheer guts of it. But then you had the other side who were just like, are you kidding me? This was just a stupid, obvious, and really dangerous stunt. And this quote from an agricultural expert really nails the consensus. He said, if he'd been growing legal crops, this would be innovative agriculture. From an engineering and a farming perspective, the idea was actually brilliant. You get amazing sunlight, great airflow, no ground pests. The problem wasn't the science, it was what he was growing. So what's the big takeaway here? For 5 months, the little town of Isabella, Alabama had a brand new landmark. It was illegal, it was notorious, but it was an undeniable part of their skyline. And one neighbor said something that really stuck with me. It's weird not seeing it up there. Isabella feels empty. Which kind of leaves us with one last interesting thought to chew on. Can a crime also become a cultural moment?